Alrighty. So I wrote up a couple long form posts, recently, and I wanted to try to record some video, just going over it to see if some people might prefer the information in that way. I know a big wall of text can be daunting. So anyway, there it goes. The last post I made was it's the topic is centrism versus optimism. So centrism is a big one. I'll probably just try to read the post and see how that goes. I usually don't, but we'll try it. So often when we see overly polar sides in a conflict, as we do in politics, people tend to get sucked into one side or the other. Another stance that people will take, aside from jumping to one side or the other, is often to just try to avoid the conflict altogether. Just check out if they don't have to confront it. And obviously many do that, as they do once again, in politics. There's probably a lot of people that are just don't really take a side, don't really care. So another stance that people will take is to try to find some kind of middle ground. And now, when you hear that, just in general, you think of centrism. And so typically any attempts to do so are labeled as centrism. And centrism is often met with criticism like, well, you're not choosing my side, so I'm pissed at you. Or you're not choosing a side at all, that's weak and spineless. Or you're just trying to be friends with everyone rather than choosing any stance. Like you're not even taking a stance. Not only are you not taking a side, but you're not even taking a stance. You're just floating in the middle. So these criticisms do have validity because there are people that do kind of fit those descriptions and kind of do it in that way. However, the argument I made for a while was that centrism can be a definitive stance, and it kind of goes beyond these basic criticisms. Like you can be in this arena, but do it in a better way. So not just the middle ground between two stances. And many issues are not polar to begin with. Like it's not a hard right or wrong. And in fact, I'd say most issues are that way. Most issues are not like a hard yes or no, right or wrong, black or white. They're a spectrum in between where you can say, okay, well, I lean a little bit more in this direction, somewhere in the middle, or a combination of things. And I think that's important. I think any logical person understands that that's a more reasonable stance to take, and not to just jump to one side or go all in on one thing or oversimplify, to kind of break it apart and say, well, I agree with this and that, but I don't really like this and that. I find myself somewhere leaning towards this direction. I think most people, reasonable people, would agree that that's a more reasonable and productive kind of stance to take, because when we allow ourselves to get into over polarized conflicts, that obviously creates a lot of separation, a lot of fighting, a lot of distraction, a lot of problems. But if we can learn to be reasonable, find some nuance, find some compromises, find some balance, I think there's a lot of good takeaways from that. I'm using my hands a lot. I don't know how much that's making it on camera, but I feel like that sometimes that helps. Sometimes that helps communicate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, you can find a perspective that is in between two polar extremes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the perfect middle. You might end up leaning towards one side or being anywhere on that spectrum, and that's natural, that's normal. But so I made this distinction. So it's like this distinction between what is commonly thought of as centrism versus this kind of like side of centrism that I was trying to say was good, because this has been a huge theme for me, the idea of balance. And it even ties in, I know, to a little bit of an aside, but Tim Leary has an 8-circuit model of consciousness, and there are 2 entire circuits of consciousness that kind of talk about this distinction. The second circuit talks very much about the black and white, attack versus submit, dominance and submission, attacking, choosing sides, polarities. It's much more simplified. This is something that even our more core animal nature can understand. Whereas the third circuit, which evolved later on as we kind of developed the capacity to be more rational, the third circuit is where we can bring things in this third dimension, and we can see another perspective, the outside perspective, the third perspective. We can see the potential for a balance or an in-between. So this is the third circuit. So these are like entirely different circuits of of our brains that are firing here. This is why people tend to get stuck in the Second Circuit. And it takes training to think rationally, reasonably in a Third Circuit way. So anyway, so I made this distinction between these two kind of definitions of centrism. And it got to the point where I wanted to basically call this second thing, this description I was giving, I wanted to just call it something different. That way it would not be associated with centrist, because I did feel like that the perspective that people assume is centrist, where they're just spineless or just trying to find the middle point or whatever, I do feel like that almost is more captured by centrist. Sometimes it's worth working to find a word and to try to change its definition. Other times it's better to just find a new word or create one. So I was leaning in that second direction. Let's find a new word. So one word that I've come across that I've used frequently for this general idea is balance. You know, you're trying to find the balance. And even though, like, when you think about a balance, a lot of times people think about the I forgot what they're called, like a scale. And obviously when you're on a scale, it's not really quite like the same as being just in the center. There's not really a center. There's like a fulcrum, but you can put different amounts of things on either side to try to create a balance. Like, you could have a really dense object on one side that's smaller, and you could put like 5 different objects of lower density on the other side. And so the two sides aren't the same, but it creates a balance. So it's pretty good, but it's not great. And a lot of the connotations that people would still have with balance are similar. They'll be like, you're just trying to find a balance. You're just trying to find the middle ground. So, and also, when you're trying to look for a replacement for the word centrism or centrist, you kind of need it to be able to be used in those same parts of speech. Like, you need a word to say, oh, you're a centrist. So with the word balance, you would need some kind of like, oh, you're a balancist. But that just does, obviously that's not a word yet, and it doesn't really roll off the tongue. So I don't know, balance just felt weird. So anyway, another word that I came across in some of these conversations, and a lot of this happened over in the NLI chats, was optimize. To optimize, or to find the optimum, or to be optimal. And I really like that. You know, because for me, this denotes an effort to find nuance, to fine tune with the right ingredients and adjustments. And just being like a software or systems engineer, I think that's it. I really just like it. It's just, it denotes more complexity. The word itself denotes a situation that is not a black or white, that there's not an assumption that there's two sides. Like, when you're talking about central, you're typically thinking on a 2D. I guess you can maybe think about like a 3D or a more complex shape. But typically I feel like people think of a line, and you're like the center of the line. Same with balance. You're typically thinking about two sides. However, with optimize, it's definitely not pinned into that like two-sided from the get-go, which I think is great, because again, most situations are not easily boiled down into two sides. So as an added synchronicity to that, right, when you're trying to convert the word optimize into a descriptive version to say like you are a blank, you know, the first word you might try to do is to say you are an optimist. You are an optimist. Now, obviously, optimist is already a word, and it has a little bit of a different definition. That doesn't quite mean that, because when we say it this way, we're trying to say a person who optimizes. But the word optimist means, you know, someone who is like positive or looks for the most positive definite or description or outlook in things. And I was actually okay with this double entendre, with this having this extra meaning, because optimism is something I have been associated with in the past. I even remember I went to a couple of like tech events in Atlanta, and one of the last ones, a guy remembered me from the discussions we had before. We had gotten discussing just like, who knows, politics, world events and stuff like that. And he goes, there he is. There's the optimist. And you're an optimist. I just thought that just always stuck with me. You know, the fact that someone, I obviously didn't say I was, but he just saw my perspective and he goes, oh, you're an optimist. And I was really like that, because I do think that that's what I try to do. I mean, I try to be white pilled. I try not to be too black pilled. I think it's essential to look for the best outcome and work towards it. So anyway, I just thought it was cool that this kind of word could mean both. And so yeah, that's kind of the point here, is just to make a distinction to say, hey, there is this way to not get sucked into the polar opposites, to be an optimist, to find the optimum. It's not always in the middle, but it's about finding that nuance. And I'll stop it there.